Hello everyone! Before I celebrate my 10th anniversary on YouTube next week, there's one more movie discussion I want to fit in. I've been contemplating doing this for a decade now, and it's time I just go for it. Let's talk about Citizen Kane. Released in 1941, directed by and starring Orson Welles, Citizen Kane chronicles the life and death of an eccentric newspaper magnate whose own public and personal life frequently made headlines. Wanting to dig deeper to figure out what drove him and what he meant by his cryptic final word, a member of the press tracks down Kane's old associates to get their side of the story. Let me preface this chat by saying I don't think the world needs my take on Citizen Kane. This film has already been analyzed extensively and scrutinized from every angle. It's also been placed on a pedestal and then knocked off of that pedestal. It is loved and hated, respected and dismissed. People are still arguing to this day whether it's overrated or underrated. And when I think about all that, I'm inclined to say, skip it, let's talk about something else. But there's another part of me that's always wanted to say, hey, just for the record, here's what I think about Citizen Kane. So, for anyone who's ever wanted to know, this is for you. I like Citizen Kane. I've seen it 3 or 4 times, including, yes, one time in a film class. That was my second viewing, and I was excited about it. I was probably the most excited person in the whole class. And I enjoy it. I don't love it. I would never consider it one of my favorites, but I like it. There are a number of things I get a kick out of, the character dynamics are interesting, and the entire thing is a work of art. If you haven't watched many old movies, you might not realize how different it is compared to other films from that time. I'm not knocking old movies, on the contrary, the late 30s through the 40s is probably my favorite period for film. It was a fresh, innovative time that produced tons of great stuff that I love. But even so, there was nothing quite like Citizen Kane. It somehow feels surprisingly modern. It has a fast pace and a hectic energy, and because its themes and characters are recognizable and relatable, it has a certain timelessness, despite being over 80 years old and revolving around the now almost extinct newspaper business. From its opening, with the stark title glowing against the black screen, the main character's death, and the lengthy newsreel that previews the entire story, to its closing with the infamous Rosebud reveal and even the unusual styling of the end titles, it bucks convention. But that's what Orson Welles did. He was born to shake things up. The then 25-year-old actor, producer, director, and writer, having already stunned the world with his revolutionary theater and radio productions, approached motion pictures with the same unique vision and mindset. There was a lot he didn't know about the technical side of movie making, but as he later acknowledged, his ignorance was actually an asset. He didn't know what supposedly couldn't be done, so if he had an idea, he set about finding a way for his team to pull it off, often with groundbreaking results. His first major feature establishes the trademarks that would characterize most of his later films. His fingerprints are all over Citizen Kane, so I'm always bewildered when people try to downplay his contribution, claiming he doesn't deserve the praise he gets, he was just an arrogant, bumbling amateur who got lucky, surrounding himself with talent whose skills and style he copied and passed off as his own. He didn't make Citizen Kane by himself, of course. Playing pivotal roles in helping him manifest his vision were cinematographer Gregg Toland, editor, later director Robert Wise, and composer Bernard Herrmann, all brilliant men in their own right, for whom Citizen Kane was one of many great achievements. I know Orson Welles isn't remembered as a particularly humble man, but Gregg Toland's contribution was so enormous that, in a wild departure from tradition, he was given the final spot in the credits. The last card is always reserved for the director, but Orson Welles gave Toland credit after himself. It's a very unusual thing, and if that's not a humble acknowledgement of the huge effect Toland's cinematography had on every shot in the film, I don't know what is. The original screenplay was also a collaborative effort between Welles and writer Herman Mankiewicz. A couple years ago, when David Fincher's film Mank came out, promotional material asked the titillating question, who really wrote Citizen Kane? The insinuation being that you would be shocked to learn it wasn't Welles. But look at the credit for screenplay. Herman Mankiewicz's name has always been there, listed first above Welles. I do think the final script for Citizen Kane has more overlap with the rest of Welles's filmography as opposed to Mankiewicz's, which just tells me that Welles's contributions were significant. Allegedly, it was Mankiewicz who made Charles Foster Kane a mirror image of newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst. The similarities were glaring, which led a furious Hearst to do everything in his considerable power to squash the film and discredit Welles. His efforts were largely successful. The film, though well received, did poorly at the box office, and while it was nominated for 9 Academy Awards, only the screenplay won. And Hearst's nose wasn't the only one put out of joint by this young upstart. By barging into Hollywood with his own ideas and his own troupe of stage actors from the Mercury Theater, he upset the hierarchy of the studio system. For his sins and rebellious spirit, Welles had to be punished. And nothing went smoothly for the rest of his career. Whether it was the horror of learning the magnificent Ambersons and Touch of Evil had been cut beyond recognition by interfering studio executives, or the frustrations of budgetary constraints when he switched to making films in Europe. Meanwhile, Citizen Kane kind of disappeared, until it resurfaced some years later in a more receptive post-war world, and that's when it started to climb its way to the top of the list of best films ever made. There are so many things that make it special. Its lighting, its deep focus shots, its long takes, its transitions, its unnerving angles, its use of shadow and makeup to age or distort characters' faces. It's a little quirky, which is an odd fit for such a dramatic plot, and sometimes the film feels almost fantastical. Yet the snappy, naturalistic, overlapping dialogue, which is a Welles trademark, gives it a feeling of realism. Many of the featured actors had no prior experience working on films, but despite this being their debut, there's nothing amateurish about their performances, and many of them went on to enjoy successful careers in film after Welles's introduction. My favorite of these, of course, is Joseph Cotten. As Jedediah Leland, Kane's best buddy and dramatic critic at The Inquirer, Joseph Cotten acts as the main character's conscience. He doubts Kane's choices, stands up to him, questions him about betraying his declaration of principles. Seeing the writing on the wall, he tries to get away, but Kane digs in, reluctant to release anyone he likes.
Well, you said yourself you were looking for someone to do dramatic criticism. I am drunk. I want to go to Chicago. You're too valuable here.
Shortly after, the fiasco that is Susan Alexander's operatic debut ends the friendship. In reality, Cotten and Welles were good, lifelong friends. Thankfully, I don't think they ever had an issue like what came between Leland and Kane, although professionally their paths did drift apart. They were frequently in contact in their later years, and in the last couple pages of Joseph Cotten's autobiography, he talks about Welles. He was very encouraging after Cotten had a stroke. They talked on the phone for a couple hours every week, and he was very enthusiastic about his book. He loved it, and they were going to meet up and discuss publishing it and maybe even making a movie when Welles suddenly passed away, a loss that Cotten felt very deeply. Another pair of performances that stand out to me are those of Ruth Warrick and Dorothy Comingore as the first and second Mrs. Kane. The women are so different from each other that it's a little crazy, this extreme contrast in personality and temperament, and the way they change in response to him over time is different as well, but the result is the same. It's interesting that of all the principal characters, one of the ones we know the least is Kane. The whole point of the story is to find out what made this mysterious, dominating figure tick, and what he was thinking about as he was dying. But the story's a jumble of conflicting reports and biased accounts, leading the reporter at the end to lament that the whole investigation has been a giant jigsaw puzzle. He never gets his answer. We do, in the last frame, but it really doesn't tell us anything definite, and we never seem to get close enough to understand Kane any better than his associates did. But this is apparently intentional, and it has nothing to do with Wells's tremendous performance. It is a curious biopic that leaves you with as many questions as you had when you started. I also want to give a nod to Agnes Moorehead as Kane's mother. Her screen time is short, but she leaves an unforgettable impression. She's so stiff and remote and almost robotic that part of me feels like Charlie should be glad to get away instead of fighting it and then secretly longing to go back. But then again, we all yearn for the halcyon days of our childhood or youth as we get older. Even if it wasn't that great, memory tends to add a filter that softens the edges. And that's what Kane is remembering. He remembers being young and carefree, unfettered by adult problems and adult expectations and adult emotions. He yearns to be the kid playing in the snow. At this point in the video, I want to share some of my favorite parts. These are in no particular order, except I've got to put this first because it is my favorite line.
I did lose $1 million last year. I expect to lose $1 million this year. I expect to lose $1 million next year. You know, Mr. Thatcher, at the rate of $1 million a year, I'll have to close this place in 60 years.
I just love the cheeky delivery. Kane isn't always a terribly likable guy, and in this moment he's being a little arrogant and foolhardy, but he says this with such a sassy expression that it's charming rather than obnoxious. And I realized that his face here is similar to his expression when we first see him in The Third Man, and that's how I figured out that cheeky Orson Welles is my favorite Orson Welles. Here's another favorite bit.
Don't worry about me! I'm Charles Foster Kane!
I like quoting that line, but there's rarely a time when it's appropriate, and nobody ever appreciates it. I'm Charles Foster Kane! It's also a great scene within context. You've got Kane shouting the equivalent of the petty politician or celebrity line, "Do you know who I am?" And yet he's hollering it down the stairs at a man's back, and when we see Jim Geddes' face, we know the threat holds no weight. Kane doesn't have as much power as he thinks he does, and by getting emotional, he's just showing his vulnerability. I'm gonna send you to Sing Sing, Geddes! To Sing Sing!
Sing, sing, Geddes! Sing, sing!
And there's this speech from Bernstein, played by Everett Sloane, something that I've got to credit Roger Ebert for helping me appreciate.
A fella will remember a lot of things you wouldn't think he'd remember.
It's one of those things that doesn't really advance the plot, it doesn't answer the big question, it doesn't need to be there, but it's one of the best speeches in the film because it's a relatable sentiment.
But I'll bet a month hasn't gone by since that I haven't thought of that girl.
I like how the reporter, Mr. Thompson, played by future B-movie producer William Alland, is almost always kept in the shadows, shot from behind or in silhouette. I don't know why he's always obscured. Maybe it's to help the audience identify with him, or maybe it's to represent that he's being kept in the dark, literally and figuratively. I love the abrupt switch from newsreel to screening room. With a click, the whole movie changes, abandoning the documentary style for more realistic, though highly stylized, visuals, and finally introducing dialogue. I especially love the side view of the screen with beams of light shooting into the room. It's magical. By the way, is it just me, or is Joseph Cotten in that scene? Not playing Leland, but playing one of the reporters. Every time I watch this, I see this person in the back, and I'm like, that's him! That's totally him! and I'm pretty sure I can hear him speak one line.
Where? What were they? What was it? Rosebud.
One other note about Cotten, his old age makeup is more obvious and less convincing than Welles. His eyes are just too young and bright, and in his autobiography he talks about their struggle with this, and also how he added the visor because his hairline just wasn't coming out right. It's very funny to read about, especially the way he describes it all. One of the fun things about these scenes is how he keeps asking the reporter for a contraband cigar, and before he leaves, he tells him to buy a box at the drugstore and send it in.
Have them wrap them up to look like toothpaste or something, or they'll stop them at the desk. You know that young doctor I was telling you about? Well, he's got an idea he wants to keep me alive.
I always look forward to the breakfast montage, an ingenious bit of economy that's been copied many times since. So much information is conveyed so effectively in a short amount of time. I also enjoy Susan's puzzle montage, just because I know somebody, or more likely a handful of somebodies, had to sit around completing 85% of one puzzle after another to get those shots. And I love the montage of Mr. Thatcher's outraged reactions to Kane's headlines attacking him. George Coulouris does blustering pomposity so well.
I think it would be fun to run a newspaper.
I enjoy the chaos of the scene where Kane, Leland, and Bernstein show up to take over the Enquirer. It's all hustle and bustle, and for a second it feels like a screwball comedy. In real life, though, I'd be just as incensed as this poor guy.
How do you do, Mr. Carter?
Carter?
Yeah, yes?
Mr. Carter.
How do you do?
Mr. Carter.
Yes, how do you do?
Mr. Carter.
Yes, Mr. Bernstein.
Mr. Carter.
Citizen Kane.
And then there's the comical enormity of Xanadu's main hall. Kane and Susan have to yell at each other to be heard, the room echoes, the fireplace is colossal, and the only furniture is a sad couch and armchair plopped in the middle of this cold, pathetic space. It would be the funniest scene in the movie, were it not also kind of depressing. This time when I watched it, I appreciated how in the last few minutes they fix what would have been a glaring plot hole. It appears that Kane dies alone. There's no one else in the room to hear his last word. But then the butler, played by Paul Stewart, reveals that he was there and he heard it. Whew, almost wrecked the whole thing. Bernard Herrmann's music, by the way, does so much to pull the film together. It's a rich, diverse score, sometimes wistful, sometimes majestic, sometimes ominous. Every note or chord is perfectly aligned with what's on screen. And the song about how great Kane is has been running through my head for the past week. Oddly enough, I almost forgot to comment on Welles's own performance, yet he's not overshadowed by the visuals or the editing or the cast or any other feature, though an actor with less presence might have been. Throughout the film, he remains the central figure. Not a protagonist per se, but the case the film is trying to solve. Physically and emotionally, Welles's performance covers a broad spectrum. Sometimes you feel you understand Kane, other times he's inscrutable. And while Welles had this great, deep voice and was able to pull off these big moments where he's booming, I'm actually more impressed by the little moments when he speaks softly with restraint.
Don't smile, Jedediah. Got it all written out. Declaration of Principles.
You don't want to make any promises, Mr. Kane, you don't want to keep.
These will be kept.
Those are some of my favorite moments, but there are so many other cool shots and neat edits and clever bits of trivia, like how they tore up the floorboards so they could put the camera down there and shoot the actors from below, like how they included the ceiling in some shots, which is a thing that just wasn't done, like how people debated over the cockatoo screech transition and what it was supposed to mean, until finally Welles revealed that he just threw that in there to wake up anyone who might have been falling asleep. I thought it was supposed to represent an emotional outburst as Susan leaves, since it's right after that Kane infamously and bizarrely destroys the room. Other visual marvels include the nurse's reflection in the snow globe, showing Susan's performance from the front and again from the back, the shot where Leland and Bernstein discuss Kane dancing with the showgirls in the reflection between them, this optical illusion where the wall and the windows appear to be much closer closer until Kane walks toward them. The opening sequence with the no trespassing sign and the various gates fading between different shots of Kane's Xanadu with the unfinished castle stationary in the distance, but though we get closer and change perspective, the lighted window stays the same size. I could go on because there's so much to say. It's so easy to watch this movie, or any innovative old movie, and miss these things and take them for granted. I know that I did the first time I saw this, and that's why I'm tempted to give everything a shout out. I guess I want to show that, at least for me, Citizen Kane isn't what a lot of people assume it to be, or accuse it of being. It's not boring, it's not pretentious, it's not ancient or inaccessible. I think by putting it on a pedestal, people made it seem those things, but if you just watch it, it's a lively, entertaining, refreshing film that does what it does extremely well. Is it the best, or one of the best films ever made? I don't know. I'm hardly one to judge, but I don't have any problem with people giving it that title. Those are my thoughts on Citizen Kane, such as they are. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you got something out of it. Let me know your thoughts on this giant of a film in the comments below, and I'll be back next Saturday with my 10th anniversary special. Thanks for watching.